Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason. We are continuing this week with our look at the 1987 Target novelizations, and we are up to the month of May, which, if memory serves me right, is the same month that Peter Parker married Mary Jane in the comic books. And it is The Faceless Ones, a novelization of the classic Patrick Troughton six-part serial. Classic referring perhaps to the age of the story rather than the quality, but that is a topic we can debate over the coming hour or so. My guest this week is a longtime friend, very well known in online Doctor Who fandom, Shannon Patrick Sullivan of A Brief History of Time Travel and many other projects. Shannon and I have known each other for just about 30 years. We'll talk about the details during the conversation. Shannon will talk about his projects. We'll talk about the Faceless Ones. We'll talk about, well, many other things, including baseball. Be warned, there will be an audio clip. But this is a great conversation. I'm very excited to share it with you. So let's get to it.
A Whovian and a Nuvian walk into a TARDIS
and explore every episode of the classic Doctor Who series.
Join me, podcaster John S. Drew,
and me, writer-editor Jim Beard, as we take apart each story starting from the very beginning in 1963.
And join us on our Facebook page and Twitter, where we continue the discussion with you with historical artifacts from British papers of the time. The Doctor's Beard podcast, released every Saturday around tea time on your favorite podcasting app.
And we'll see you in time and space. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature. Keep turning the pages.
So the scene is Manhattan in the summer of the year 2000, and a young underweight lawyer is doing his first law firm job in the city of New York, working in the same building where the Mad Bomber had plied his trade in the 1930s and 40s. That building fortunately no longer exists. One of my online friends told me that he was coming to New York, and I met him for the first time in the summer of 2000 at a cafe near Lincoln Center. And that friend is Shannon Patrick Sullivan of the Brief History of Time Travel website and so many more Doctor Who goodies online. Shannon, this is the first time that I've seen you face-to-face in exactly 24 years.
It is. It's wonderful to see you again. We were supposed to see each other again exactly 10 years ago at Gallifrey 1, but in a rare occurrence of climate oddity, the folks coming from the eastern seaboard of the United States got grounded, and we somehow got out of Newfoundland, which doesn't usually happen. We're usually at the whim of the weather when it comes to air travel. So I got to Gallifrey 1 that year, my only Gallifrey 1, and sadly you didn't.
And I have been to, I think, 7 or 8 of the next galleys after that, and that was the one that I missed. I'm still annoyed about it. Still annoyed. But the snow came Friday night. The snow came Thursday night. By Friday morning, it was a couple of feet. And if I had gone to JFK instead of LaGuardia and gotten on standby lines, I probably would have gotten off the ground Friday morning. But it just wasn't possible. So I was home all weekend, cold, alone, and shivering. And you had fun.
We did. My wife and I went. She is a Doctor Who watcher, but not a Doctor Who fan. I think is the distinction I'd make there. And well, I mean, full credit to Sean Lyon and his team. I mean, they do a phenomenal job. And one day I shall go back, as somebody said once upon a time. But yes, but because of that, it is now 24 years since we last were able to look each other in the eye, and it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, I was pleased to hear that you were a listener. I don't always know who my audience is, but when you messaged me with a correction to one of my scripts, I'm like, oh, you're a listener? Oh my goodness, you're big time. So well, I knew immediately I had to have you on the show.
Don't know about that. I'm a late comer to podcasts, I have to admit. when I was at Gallifrey One in 2014, there was a lot of conversations about podcasts and what people were listening to, and I was just kind of smiling and nodding. But in all honesty, I'm a latecomer to having a smartphone. I resisted for a long time. I was very content with my flip phone up until the pandemic. And then it became clear that I really needed a smartphone, if nothing else, because our daughter at that point was only about 2 years old. And for the purposes of communicating with her childcare and stuff like that, texting by keying in digits multiple times wasn't going to cut it anymore. So I finally took the plunge, got a smartphone, and still didn't really explore the world of podcasting for a while until I wound up finding myself co-writing one. And once I was there, it was pretty obvious that, you know what, there's clearly a lot of really good podcasts out there. Some of them by people I know and very much respect. I should really give these a listen and see what's out there. So I am.
There is so much volume and quality out there. And it's not just Doctor Who podcasts for me. My subscriptions also include history, political, movie, and baseball podcasts. So Doctor Who is only about 1/5 of my podcast subscription. So I basically have two rules now for podcasts. Number one, the podcast cannot be a snarky hate watch. Those can be very funny if you're in the right mood, but if every single episode is worthy of snark, there's no point in being a fan. So I try to save my outrage for a select few episodes, and I try and be at least nuanced, if not outright positive, about everything else. And unfortunately, my other rule is if I am not a guest on your show, I don't have time to listen to it because there's just so much out there. So if you have me on, I will download your show and listen to it. If you haven't had me on in a while, I may drift away. If you don't know me, there's a chance now that I can't listen to your show because I just don't have the time, which is a terrible philosophy to have. But unfortunately, there's only 24 hours in a day, and I'm asleep for 5 or 6 of them. So that doesn't leave a lot of time.
Absolutely. The number of podcasts I'd like to listen to, books to read, DVDs to watch. I still have many Doctor Who DVDs, especially the animated ones that I bought, and I'm looking forward to watching them eventually. When that's going to be, that's between all the other interests that I've got, between work, between spending time with my wife and daughter, like you said, and sadly, we do need to sleep. It's an irritant, but I haven't found a way around it yet.
Well, as Tom Baker said, sleep is for tortoises. And unfortunately, I'm very much a turtle these days. So which is the podcast, and of course you and I know the answer to this, but not everybody listening might. Which podcast do you co-write?
So I am now the co-writer of one of Toby Haydock's podcasts, his Too Much Information strand, which takes a look at each episode, not each story, but each episode of Doctor Who, starting from the very beginning. Toby began that in, I think it was the fall of 2020. And in fact, my very first plunge into any type of podcasting was to listen to that first episode, because this idea of this look at an episode in the deepest possible detail, so going into how it was made, who made it, how it evolved from script to screen and all that kind of thing. I mean, that's my wheelhouse. That's the stuff that I've always really been interested in. It's the full creative process of making an episode of Doctor Who for television. So he released that in 2020, and I listened to it. I loved it. I said, I should really listen to more of these. And I didn't, in all honesty, because then, because again, I still hadn't quite gotten into that train of podcasting really being part of, my day and something that I'd listen to on my morning and afternoon commutes or anything like that. But I kind of, I kept track of the episodes as they were coming out, thinking, yep, eventually I'll listen to that for sure. And I noticed that the frequency of them had slowed a little bit. And I've got Toby on Facebook. In fact, he and I met at Gallifrey One, and one day there last summer, he kind of put out an appeal for advice, because he was very well aware that his frequency of releasing these podcasts had slowed to a crawl, and he was trying to figure out how to get back on track. And there's a ton of work that goes into this. It's going through all the documentation that survived from the early 60s, going through each script and comparing it to the televised episode, going into the background, the biographies of the people who made it, whether that's the actors or the behind-the-scenes crew. Each episode of Too Much Information spotlights at least one person, and not the obvious people usually. Guest cast members and members of the behind-the-scenes crew who work in the design departments and things like that. And so it goes into deep and thorough detail on their biographies, which is not information that's always easily obtained. And so he was really just looking for a suggestion about how do I come back to the schedule that he'd originally planned, which was a monthly schedule, because these podcasts are initially released on his Patreon page. So there's folks who are paying good money as a Patreon subscription to get these early, and then eventually they come out through all the usual places that podcasts can be found. And so I wrote to him. I said, well, I don't know if this is the kind of thing that you're looking for, but if you want somebody to help you write the scripts, I'm interested in giving it a try. I didn't know that I'd necessarily have the combination of writing style and witticism, because Toby's a very funny guy, and I'm less practiced in my comedy, to really pull this off and make it still feel like it's part of the same series. But if you'd like me to write a script as kind of a pilot, I'm willing to do that. And he said sure. And I think somebody else had kind of made a similar offer. So he was still working on Marco Polo at this point, and I think he had one or two scripts left to go. So he said, well, why don't you start? To me, he said, with the Aztecs, so 2 stories along. And I think the other person he asked, who inquired about this, he got them to start with the Keys of Marinus. And I put my script together, sent it off to him, realized that the biography element was not something that I was comfortable doing. I can pull these things together. I've got on my website, A Brief History of Time Travel, I've got very brief capsule biographies of a lot of the major players in Doctor Who history. But in terms of really what Toby does, which is dig really deeply into where these folks come from and what they did and where they wound up after Doctor Who and all that kind of thing. If nothing else, I don't have the knowledge of British television and British cinema, British culture, even more broadly, to do as effective a job as Toby did. So I finally, after working on it to the best of my ability, I sent it back to him and I said, I can do the episode stuff. I can do the production notes. I can do the script to screen element. I don't think I'm the right person to do the cast biographies. I said, so if you're interested, why don't we continue co-writing these? And I'll take care of the stuff that I'm comfortable with. You do the cast biographies. Hello, Smudge. And if that sounds good to you, then that sounds good to me as well. And in the interim, the other person evidently had decided, no, this is more work than I was anticipating. I don't think I can commit to this. So he said, all right, well, why don't we give this a go? Let's proceed with this, and we'll see how it works out. And if at some point one of us isn't happy with this, we'll stop. And so far, it's going pretty well, I got to say.
I'm really happy to hear that, because I am definitely along the same vein. I want as much information as I can about where this story comes from. And one of the great things about reading the books is that I will have the online transcript open. And after every chapter, I can go back and read the corresponding scenes. And you can see, because the novelizations are largely based on the rehearsal scripts, and you can see exactly what changed and what bits of physical comedy, especially in the Tom Baker years, and to a large extent too the Troughton years, what bits of physical comedy did not get captured for the novelization. I'll discuss in my audio essay for Faceless Ones, but Faceless Ones makes much less play of the fact that people's accents change once they become chameleons. And that's a great clue on TV, but it's really, with one minor exception, not present in the novelization at all. I love reverse engineering that stuff, and when I get the Blu-ray collections, I immediately go into the production file, and I go to the oldest copy of whatever script is available. So, I mean, the Hand of Fear script, you can see Robert Holmes's original lame attempt at the Sarah Jane departure scene. It's terrible, but I love being able to see it. You can see the actual script written for William Hartnell when he says goodbye to Susan in Dalek Invasion of Earth, which is a distant cousin of the lines that William Hartnell could remember in studio. And come to find out, his found poetry version is actually a little better than what's on the printed page. And now with Celestial Toymaker, with the recent Terry Nation Army video, going through that script and looking through the whiteout and trying to figure out which of 4 different people wrote that particular page, I love that stuff. In fact, for a weaker story like Faceless Ones, that sort of behind-the-scenes detail is what keeps me going more than the story itself.
That was really how I first fell in love with the idea of chronicling the making of Doctor Who. Understanding those creative decisions, what changed from early drafts to what eventually made it onto the screen, what stories were planned but for one reason or another never came to be. Actors, what actors were they thinking of casting in different roles? And then they decided to go a different direction. And how would things have looked had the original person that they had in mind actually accepted the job, or they had stuck with that plan and not gone some other way? That stuff has always fascinated me. Go ahead.
That's especially relevant this week because Donald Sutherland just passed away at age 88, and he was reportedly on the short list for the Gunfighters. We could have had Donald Sutherland in Doctor Who for 4 weeks.
Yes, indeed. That would have been quite something. Every now and then you'll see these potential casting, and especially for older episodes, and you just think, oh God, that would have been amazing if somebody like Donald Sutherland had made even a brief appearance in Doctor Who. Just to be able to look back 50, 60 years later and say, yeah, there he is. One of his first acting jobs was in this show. That would have been quite something.
Like Daniel Kaluuya in Planet of the Dead, or Felicity Jones in Unicorn and the Wasp, or going back to the Hand of Fear Blu-ray, there's the handwritten casting notes for each character, I assume out of the pen of Lenny Mayne. And there, right under Glenn Houston, for the director of the nuclear power plant, is my Brooklyn neighbor, Patrick Stewart. Imagine him on Doctor Who when he still had hair. Yes, indeed.
Oh, there's still time. Hopefully we'll get him yet. Russell. Well, he's already, the 2025 episodes are already filmed, but hopefully there will be more, and who knows, maybe Patrick Stewart will show up yet. We've got Ian McKellen, so...
They're practically twins at this point. So, coming back to brief history of time travel, the reason that I knew you in the year 2000 when you came to New York is because you and I were both veterans of Rec Arts Doctor Who in the early to mid to late 90s. And my heyday was between 1992 and 1997, 98. And you kind of overlapped me. You were a little bit younger than I was.
Yeah.
But the first major thing that you did in terms of contributing to fandom was taking over the ratings, the rankings for the new adventure novels. And anytime I finished a book, I would email you my score. And you would once a month post the top 10 or whatever the rankings were for the NAs. And we could see that by 1994, any book that just came out automatically came into the top 10 before reality caught up and it dropped down. And it was fascinating to see, like, Strange England was in the top 10 for a while. Books that folks don't recall as fondly as some of the others. Any new book that came out was immediately embraced by fandom, and you were there chronicling.
I was, and it was fun. Steve Traylon, full credit to Steve, started the rankings. But as you say, this was the early days of the internet. I started university in 1994, and that's when I discovered the internet, discovered Rec Arts Doctor Who. And I think I took over the rankings probably about a year later. And so this was done very, very primitively by today's standards. Like I said, people would just email me lists of numbers, and sometimes as the series went on, very lengthy lists of numbers. And I would have a sheet of paper that I would scribble all these down on, and once a month I'd sit down and I'd plug them all into a calculator. I didn't even maintain a spreadsheet, which is madness looking back on it now. I purely, doing this by hand, and figured out the new numbers and would type it all up and post it along with a bit of news on what we'd heard was coming up in the Virgin novels, and then later on the BBC Books novels. And it was nice, partly because I loved the new adventures. I didn't love every single one, but it was having discovered Doctor Who in 1990 and having discovered that, this show that I now love has just been canceled, and they're not making any more of these, which was dispiriting, even though, of course, I had tons of stories that I hadn't watched at that point in time. But then to discover that, well, actually, it kind of is continuing, and it's kind of continuing in a vein that is really targeted very much at older teenagers, people in their 20s, kind of my demographic, while it probably wasn't great for the global health and appeal of the range, was, I fell right into that sweet spot. So talking about the novel, speculating on what was coming, that was something I thoroughly enjoyed doing, and being able to be kind of on the periphery of it by maintaining these rankings and kind of guiding folks as to what books were good if they hadn't dipped their toes into those waters yet, and what was coming up, and that kind of thing was a lot of fun, and to a certain extent then helped with my first major web-based endeavor, which was the Doctor Who news page.
I remember that. That's right.
The news page grew out of a desire to collate all the information that was coming out about the Doctor Who TV movie in 1996, because I'm sure you remember the rumors and the misinformation, whether wittingly or unwittingly, that was flooding certainly Rekart's Doctor Who at that time, because the web itself was very much in its earliest days. It was a lot, and it was very hard for anybody who wasn't willing to sit down and wade through what at the time was hundreds of daily posts on Rekart's Doctor Who to try to figure out what's actually going on here. That was intimidating. And so I thought, okay, well, there was already a Rekart's Doctor Who FAQ list that Siobhan Morgan was maintaining.
I was the keeper of the FAQ, and I gave it to Siobhan after
a
year.
Well, there's something I did not know. Well, there we go. And I thought, well, we need something that's kind of similar, that's maybe a little bit more agile, that can be updated a bit more frequently. So, whereas the newsgroup FAQ was a bit more of a static document that only got updated occasionally, I thought, well, something separate that we can use to keep track of all this information and hopefully keep track of it accurately would be really useful. So I wrote that up, and then I thought, well, the newsgroup is great, but as I said, the web was in its early days, and it was becoming increasingly clear to me that there were Doctor Who fans on the internet, but not on Rekart's Doctor Who. So I thought, okay, well, I already had a bit of a website at that point, basically just a little episode guide, a personal homepage that I'd created. That would have been December of 1995. So let's add this FAQ to it. And then that kind of very quickly evolved into a Doctor Who news page. I say a news page and not the news page, because again, our friend Sean Lyon, he was also maintaining a news page in association with Gallifrey One, and so we kind of enjoyed a friendly competition then for a few years, and so I think because I had labeled mine, having been unaware of Sean's page at the time, the Doctor Who news page, I think mine kind of tended to get a little bit more attention and publicity, but it was undeserved. Sean's was every bit as good, and in many cases, I think quite a bit better than mine. And eventually they merged. I handed it over then in 1999 thereabouts to Mark Phippen, who maintained it for about a year, and then it merged with Sean's, and essentially is the Doctor Who news page that still exists now as part of Gallifrey Base. So I'm very happy to be part of the legacy of that page, although now a dim and distant part of it.
And where did Brief History of Time Travel come from, and how did it grow to its present size? Because that is one of my indispensable research sources, particularly for a story where I don't have access to the production files on Blu-ray, or where the Wikipedia page is inadequate, or my own sometimes unreliable memories fail me. You are the first page that I go to.
Well, thank you. Like I said, I've always really been fascinated by the creative process that underlies any Doctor Who episode. And that was stoked by certainly Doctor Who magazine in the early 90s, when folks like Marcus Hearn started getting into the written archives, and coming up with a lot more detail on what had happened, especially in 1963, than we had known to that point. Books like David Howe, Mark Stammers, and Stephen James Walker's The 60s and the Handbook series, Andrew Pixley's Archives, again, in Doctor Who magazine. And what became clear to me as I read and voraciously consumed these was that there was a bit of a middle ground that seemed to be missing, because you had stuff like the 60s, which were glorious books, beautiful photographs, many of which we'd never seen before at that point, but the production element was very potted. This was short, to the point. These were coffee table books aimed at a pretty general audience, whereas Andrew Pixley's Archives, or the InVision magazine, that at the time was edited by Justin Richards and Peter Angelides,
right?
These were detailed, dense texts, and it seemed to me that it would be awfully nice to have something that went into more detail than, say, the 60s did, without going quite into the weeds of an Andrew Pixley Archives, so that somebody could sit down and read something for 5 or 10 minutes and have a pretty good sense of all the major elements of the production of a story. And then if they wanted to go and find out more, it would be nice to have pointers then to where else they might get more information. And on top of that, because this was when a lot of information was coming out from that early access to things like the written archives, because this was when telesnaps were for most stories were first being distributed and published in Doctor Who magazine and other places. There was a lot of information that was evolving. There was a lot of received fan wisdom that was now being disproved. And the problem with anything in print is that once it's in print, it's fixed. And unless they're going to come out with a second edition or something like that, which was pretty clear that the handbooks weren't going to get multiple editions, the 60s and those books weren't going to get multiple editions. There was talk of the Andrew Pixley Archives eventually getting some kind of update, but that seemed years away. I thought, well, a web-based platform could be very easily updated anytime new information comes along. So since I'd been looking for something that would give me a chance to explore the Doctor Who creative process that I enjoyed so very, very much, I thought, all right, well, here's my next project. And so I started, I think, in 1997, going right back to the first story, 100,000 BC, An Unearthly Child, Tribe of Gum, Serial A, whatever you want to call it.
Pick your poison.
I do not judge. And gradually went through and put it all together. And I think that took me about 4 years. And then by that point, a lot more information had come out. So I went back and started again. And I've gone through about 4 iterations of the site now, adding different things, more information that I thought folks might find interesting. So in addition to each of the individual story entries chronicling the making of that story, there's a production diary, which lays things out chronologically. There's a section that explores all the lost stories, the unmade Doctor Who stories, of which I'm aware. And the most recent edition, and I'm going to say the final edition, but I've probably said that before, is more extensive cast and crew biographies than I previously had, just to kind of be able to put different actors and writers and directors and producers, Doctor Who experiences in somewhat broader context of their careers than I previously had done.
So coming back to your bio, you were in New York in the summer of 2000 for a very specific reason.
Yes.
And what very specific reason brought you to New York in the West 50s in the summer of 2000?
Well, one of the great cultural zeitgeists of 1999 2000 was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Which, of course, it started in the UK and then had become a huge North American hit, hosted by Regis Philbin.
Regis.
Yeah. And I don't know if many of your listeners are aware, but Canada gets every television program that's made in the United States. We have for decades. Certainly where I grew up in Newfoundland, the standard cable package that you would purchase that almost everybody did, because over the air was just the CBC and one local station, and CBC French, to be fair. But so almost everybody bought a cable package, and that would include ABC, NBC, not CBS here for some reason for a long time. One of the reasons it took me a long time to become a fan of American football. But and over time, this PBS, which would have been my first exposure to Doctor Who. So American programming has a huge influence on the media landscape in Canada as well. And so CTV, which is one of the Canadian networks, seeing the enormous popularity of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, decided, well, we should do a Canadian version. But they didn't want to build studios because I think they had been in touch with the folks at ABC who were airing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and had learned that it was an extraordinarily expensive and complex set to build. And I don't think they were convinced that they necessarily wanted to commission a full season of this game show. So they said, well, they said to ABC, can we use yours? And ABC said, well, yeah, because they weren't filming year round. They took breaks. And so they said, you can come on down when Regis isn't filming. And so they made a deal to make 2 episodes. And because we're very egalitarian here in Canada, I like to think, they decided that, well, we can't have a casting call and have all the contestants be from Ontario or something like that. We want participation from across the Canadian landscape. So they divided us up into different regions. And they said, all right, the Atlantic provinces, so Newfoundland, Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, you're one region. We're going to pick one contestant from you. Quebec, I think, got 2. Ontario got 4. The Prairies got 2, something like that. And so within that, there was a telephone contest then. You had to answer a bunch of fastest finger questions. Which given that, this was the days of before most of us had cell phones and could just stare at our phone, trying to hold the phone to your ear and listen to the choices and then punch into the keypad and do this 5 times was tricky. But then they took everybody who had successfully answered one of those, basically drew a name out of the hat, and for the Atlantic provinces, that was me. So I went down and I was a contestant on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire Canadian edition.
Now, a few months before you came to the city in July 2000, it was February 2000, and at that point you could call the hotline. I think it was there was a 2-hour window every day to call the online quiz. And if you got a perfect score, you were called to the semifinals, and if you passed the semifinals by phone, you get invited to the studio. I got back from the bar exam, and I immediately slept for 48 straight hours. And I wish I still had the ability to sleep 2 days in a row. I don't anymore. It was one of the best things I've ever done. I woke up probably Friday afternoon. Oh, it's time to call the hotline. So I called, and that particular day, they were casting folks for the episode that was going to air around the time of the Academy Awards. So it was all movie trivia. And it was the only time that I got a perfect score in the phone quiz, and I got invited to the semifinals. And the semifinals were a little bit harder. It was 5 questions, and they gave you 4 clues, but you had to rank the clues in order. And because it was for the Academy Awards show, me being a movie buff, I don't remember all the questions. One of the questions for the semifinals was, please rank the following actresses in age but it gave you their birth names and not their stage names. So Francis Gum, Norma Jean Dougherty, Winona Horowitz, etc. Please arrange these movies in geographical order from east to west. The Godfather, The Untouchables, California Suite, stuff like that. The last question was please arrange the following movies in cast size from largest to smallest, or from smallest to largest. And the movies were My Dinner with Andre, which I've mentioned several times on this show. I even did a My Dinner with Andre themed episode for Seeds of Death.
Yes.
I know that very well. Unless you count the waiter, it's a cast of 2, Wallace Shawn and Andre Gregory. Alien, which is a cast of 7 or 8. And then it was It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, which of course is a cast of thousands.
Yes.
I knew all those movies. I'd either seen them or my parents had seen them. The last one was a movie that I hadn't heard of. It was called Swimming to Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
In my head, in a matter of seconds, I instantly came up with the entire premise of this movie. 3 college students, their boat sinks, and they have to swim to Cambodia in the early 1970s, dodging American bombs. Thank you, Richard Nixon. I had the whole movie cast in my head. It would have won me an Academy Award itself had the movie in my head been made. What I should have done was I was working in a bookstore at the time, and I had the Leonard Maltin guide next to me, but there wasn't enough time to open up to the S page and look at Leonard Maltin's blurb for that movie. So I just guessed that it was 4 people, and I put it in between Dinner with Andre, 2, and Alien, 7. They don't tell you if he answers or right. They just say, we're going to call you back tomorrow between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m., and if you don't get the call, you're not on the show. They didn't call. So I immediately go to the Maltin book. Turns out Swimming to Cambodia is a monologue, Spalding Gray. And when I met my future wife the following year, 2001, that anecdote is one of the first things I told her on her first or second date. And she had been a film student at NYU. Before I even finished the anecdote, she goes, it's a monologue, one person. Had she been next to me, and I met her a year earlier and she was in the room, she would have supplied me the answer. So I didn't get on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire for the Academy Awards show in the year 2000 because I'd never heard of Spalding Gray. He then took his own life by jumping off the Staten Island ferry and washing ashore in Brooklyn a few years later, and I had mixed emotions about that. But when I watched the eventual Academy Awards show, the entire cast was guys like me, white guys in glasses wearing blue button-down shirts. I would have fit in. And the person who did the best on that show got eliminated because they didn't know the name of Quint's ship in Jaws. They didn't know about the USS Indianapolis. Shannon, if Regis had called me up, if I had been the fastest finger, if I had been there in the circle on stage and I had gotten that clue, I would have been able to recite the entire Indianapolis speech in my worst Robert Shaw accent. And I actually briefly met Ian Shaw last year when he was doing The Shark is Broken on Broadway. Got a selfie with him at the stage door. I would have gotten probably at least $250,000, whereas nobody else on stage that day got more than $32,000. I could have paid off my student loans 15 years earlier than I did if I had just heard of Spalding Gray.
You had only met your wife a year earlier.
So you have sent me 3 videotapes over the years. When the 2 Buffy episodes were pulled in the wake of the Columbine shooting in 1999, you were the person who sent me the Canadian airings of Earshot and Graduation Day Part 2, I should say. So when my daughter and I have been watching Buffy, we just finished season 6 last night at the same time as Empire of Death. Watched Empire of Death first and then The Grave second. When we got to season 3, I told her that those episodes were pulled and we didn't get to see them for months. And I thought about making her wait to watch them in American air date order rather than production order. But no, she wouldn't do that. So I told her that you were the person who gave me the VHS tapes. And I got to see the Canadian airings. And she was, you knew somebody in Canada? I'm like, do I know somebody in Canada? But the 3rd VHS that you sent me was your appearance because you were fastest finger and you made it on stage with a Canadian host. How did you do on Canadian Millionaire?
Yeah, in fact, I was the only contestant who was on both episodes because I finished off the first episode. I got up to the $1,000 mark there. So, made it to that kind of, if I don't get this far, I'm going to be very red in the face. And then started off the next episode. I made it up to the $32,000 question. And back then, $64,000 was the next milestone. So if you made it to $64,000, it didn't matter what you got wrong. You were going to take home at least that much. And it was a question. It was essentially what's also known as Digby chicken. And the choices, I will never forget the choices. They were cured herring, rubber duck, Cornish hen, and smoked lobster. Now, Digby is a town in Nova Scotia. So I'm thinking, oh, okay, I'm here representing the Atlantic provinces. I'm really supposed to get this one right. But I had never heard of Digby chicken. I had no idea. So I thought, okay, I'll use the 50-50. I'll get rid of two of these choices. And it brought it down to cured herring and smoked lobster, which wasn't very helpful. So I thought, okay. My father, who grew up in a small town on the north coast of Newfoundland, a town called Baie Verte, would often tell us, he was from a big, pretty impoverished family. There was often really no food for supper. So his mother would send him and his brothers down to the dock, down to the wharf, and they'd get them to pick lobsters up because lobsters were plentiful. And it was basically the food you would run out and you would collect when there was nothing else to put on the table. So I said, okay, Digby chicken sounds like it's, kind of meant to indicate some common type of food. Presumably that's true in Baie Verte. Maybe it's true in Digby, Nova Scotia as well. I went with smoked lobster, and unfortunately in Digby, while my rationale was entirely correct, it's herring that they collect. It's just common dinner fare, and so I felt dreadful because I'd gotten the Atlantic Canadian question wrong. So I went back to $1,000, which I was not complaining about. I was just really free trip to New York, chance to appear on national television. I was quite happy with that. But then the Canadian host was a news anchor named Pamela Wallen, and her personal assistant came over to me then. After the recording, she said, Shannon, my husband is from Digby, Nova Scotia. So after you got that question wrong, I called him. I wasn't supposed to do it, but I called him. I said, do you know what Digby chicken is? Because she didn't know. And he did not know what Digby chicken was. And as it turned out, it's a name that, at least these days, was most commonly used in conventions, things like that. A friend of mine, a former colleague of mine, had been a postal worker at one point and had gone to a postal workers convention, and he knew what Digby chicken was because they served it on plates. So the fact that somebody from Digby didn't know what Digby chicken was made me feel a whole lot better. And I got a number of emails actually then after the show had aired from folks, who again, they were from Digby or they grew up near Digby or knew somebody from Digby and had no clue what the answer was. So that made me feel at peace with my Who Wants to Be a Millionaire experience.
My only other memory of your episode, and again, I was still bitter over the whole Spalding Gray thing, but my memory is you also had a question about the 1993 World Series with the Toronto Blue Jays.
Yes.
And I think you used a lifeline for that
I
one. If you
did.
had called me, I would have given you the answer.
This day, because it was who hit the home run that basically walked off the World Series. Fortunately, I knew the answer. It was Joe Carter.
Joe has had his moments. 2 balls and 2 strikes on him. Here's the pitch on the way. A swing and a belt. Left field. Way back. Blue Jays win it. The Blue Jays are World Series champions as Joe Carter hits a 3-run home run in the 9th inning, and the Blue Jays have repeated as World Series champions. Touch 'em all, Joe. You'll never hit a bigger home run in your life.
But I had the 2 World Series transposed in my mind for whatever reason. And I thought, God, am I misremembering this? So I thought I think that may have been the $8,000 question, $4,000 question, something like that. We were getting deep enough into it that I was not convinced that the audience was going to be terribly helpful beyond this stage because these were folks collected off the streets of New York. I knew the questions were largely going to be Canadian-based, so they probably weren't going to know much beyond that stage. So although I was pretty sure it was Joe Carter, I thought, no, this is a good point to ask the audience. But in retrospect, I should have just gone with my gut because I had watched both those World Series, and I knew the answer, but I was fixated by a moment of doubt.
I was living in Maryland in college in October 1993, beginning of my junior year. It was my first year living off campus. And at that point, Maryland Public Television was showing Doctor Who on Saturday night, starting at 11 in movie format. And I was taping all the episodes off air. Game 6 of the World Series that year would have started at 8 o'clock. The game went a little bit long. Joe Carter hit the walk-off home. Now, the Phillies are winning 6-5 in the bottom of the ninth. If Mitch Williams, whose nickname was Wild Thing via the movie Major League because he couldn't throw strikes to save his life, intimidating, big guy, long hair, very long limb. When he threw the ball, you had no idea where it was coming from because he had this herky-jerky motion, and he ended up basically flat on the ground after throwing the pitch. Very fast. If you could see the ball, you could hit it, but if you couldn't see the ball, you were doomed. He puts 2 men on base, 1 out. Joe Carter hits the home run. The Blue Jays walk it off to win the game and the World Series. The game 8-6, the World Series 4-2. Had Williams gotten the last 2 outs, the game goes to Game 7 Sunday night. But because of the timing of the home run, I missed the first 5 minutes of Castrovalva, which would have been the airing on MPT that night. So thanks for nothing, Joe Carter. Castrovalva was a much better story. The Jays won in 1992 against the Braves, 93 against the Phillies, and they've never been back to the World Series since.
No, indeed. And who knows what would have happened in 1994 had the strike not happened.
Whereas the Mets have been to the World Series twice, and they've lost both. So let's change the subject neatly. How did you become a Doctor Who fan?
Gradually. So it aired on PBS in, like I say in movie format, and we were getting our PBS feed from Detroit at the time. And my mother insists that she encouraged me to watch it, and I, as a typical 11 or 12 or 13-year-old at the time, it flatly ignored her. I do remember seeing, for some reason, this very vividly stands out, seeing a listing in our TV guide for the 5 Doctors, which would have been a re-airing, probably as part of a telethon. Because PBS liked to trot that one out for telethon purposes. And it was something like the 4th Doctor is trapped in a time bubble while the 5th Doctor is trapped on Gallifrey or something like that. And this just mystified me. What? 4th, 5th Doctors? What is this? So that intrigued me. I was also, like yourself, a big fan of Choose Your Own Adventure novels. And I would often go into the bookstore and look through to see if there were any that I didn't already have. And occasionally my eye would glance over at the non-Choose Your Own Adventure, but similar types of books, like the Find Your Fate books. And I can distinctly remember picking one up that had what I now subsequently learned was Colin Baker's 6th Doctor on the cover, and thinking, this looks interesting, but then putting it back on the shelf. But finally, in the summer of 1990, not PBS, but YTV, which is a youth-oriented network here in Canada, had started airing Doctor Who episode by episode, but on a daily basis, every weekday, Monday to Friday, in the late afternoon. And I was bored one day, it was late summer. I remember turning on the TV, and basically right at the moment when John Pertwee regenerated into Tom Baker.
Ooh.
And this was intriguing. I didn't quite know what was happening here, so I kind of filed that away. That this might be something to check out if I happen to be sat in front of the TV at this time again. And I remember I kind of dipped in and out. I'd watch a little bit. I think I watched a little bit of The Ark in Space, a little bit of might have been Planet of Evil, but then Pyramids of Mars, very appropriately given that Empire of Death aired last night. Pyramids of Mars episode 2 was the first time that I sat down and basically caught it from the opening credits and watched the whole thing and said, okay, this is pretty awesome. I'm going to watch this again tomorrow. And then it became appointment television for me. And subsequently, I discovered that PBS was airing on Saturday nights, or technically early Sunday mornings, Newfoundland time, these omnibus versions. So I was getting the Tom Baker era on one hand, and I think they were airing the Sylvester McCoy episodes, or at least the season 26 then on PBS. So I was getting that, and then I think they went back to John Pertwee. So I was getting all kinds of different eras of Doctor Who in a very short time frame, and I was hooked, and haven't looked back.
That's very similar to how I discovered the show. Half an hour a day. It took me a while to get hooked. By the time Pyramids of Mars was on, I was already hopelessly in the bag for the show, but Pyramids of Mars is so good. And you'll appreciate this. The book that I'm reading now, which I immediately started after the airing of the cliffhanger to Legend of Ruby Sunday, is the Justin Richards novel. That's not the first time we've heard that name in this podcast, Justin Richards. The novel Sands of Time, which is his season 20 Missing Adventures sequel to Pyramids of Mars. And it's a very traditional sequel, and there's some timey-wimey stuff going on, and it's the kind of stuff that we now know intuitively, but in the 1990s, you had to spend a lot more time setting it up for the audience, and it takes place in the 1890s, Victorian London, and it's very evocative, and I'm enjoying it immensely because it's the classic series style of Doctor Who rather than the RTD style of Doctor Who. So it's a much more traditional sequel as opposed to Empire of Death, about which I'm going to defer my review. But yeah, I've definitely been jonesing for Pyramids of Mars this week, having seen bits of the Tales of the TARDIS that aired in the UK and contributing to the Trap 1 episode on that, which already released a couple of days ago when this episode goes out, so I'll be sure to put it in the show notes. So when would you have first seen Faceless Ones, which is 67% missing and was not released commercially until very, very recently, at least as a video?
I certainly would have watched the surviving episodes back in the early 90s, by the point where I was just trying to watch absolutely everything that existed at that point in Doctor Who. And I would have listened to the Graham Strong audio. I remember sometime in the late 90s, there was I found someone who, for a nominal fee, was willing to tape off every single Graham Strong audio track and send them to you on cassette.
Wow.
Just to really, put this in the, in the era of which it was happening. And I remember getting this big box of all of these cassettes and kind of sitting in my room for a week solid, just popping one into the tape player and listening to it and popping it out and flipping it around and popping in the next one. So I would have done that in chronological order because I am certainly anal retentive enough to listen to my audios in chronological order. And so the Faceless Ones would have been in there. The first time that I would have watched it as a full 6-part visual presentation was this week when I finally unwrapped the animated version and watched it from start to finish.
Wow.
So before that, my most intimate encounter with the Faceless Ones was the novelization. It's interesting that there are missing Doctor Who stories that I feel that I still know very well. The Evil of the Daleks, for instance, Fury from the Deep. And whether that's because in some instances there are surviving episodes or a wealth of surviving photographs and telesteps and things like that, or just they're stories that are talked about so much that you really feel like you know them even if you haven't watched them. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there are stories that I feel like even having written about them and through a brief history of time travel, written about them in quite a lot of detail, I still feel very remote from them. The Mythmakers is one of those. The Savages is one of those. The Faceless Ones is one of those. So having finally gotten a chance to sit down and at least watch it and then follow it up by rereading the novelization for the first time in years, I feel like I know this better now than I ever have before. So I'm kind of a come lately to the Faceless Ones.
This is a story that I struggled with. I would have probably first read it through the various online transcripts in the 1990s. I know I didn't buy the novelization when it first came out. It was one of the last novelizations that I bought. I read it once. I don't know it as well as I know the books that I bought earlier in my fandom, because 87 was kind of a low ebb of Doctor Who fandom for me. It took me a while to get back into it. So for a while I was buying the books out of habit and either reading them once or not reading them. So I have few memories of Faceless Ones in book form. At this point, I then started to get the earliest VHS telesnap recons in the late 1990s. So I was visiting a fan friend in Columbus, Ohio when I was in law school, and we watched the telesnap recons and the 2 surviving episodes of Faceless Ones, and I was able to get a dub of that video. So at this point it was 8th or 9th generation, but I saw it. It's just not a story that sings to me, and I think part of that is because it, as you and I were talking before the recording, this is a Malcolm Hulk story, at least in part, but it doesn't play like any other story that Malcolm Hulk has written, and it doesn't really have the same intensity as his other scripts in terms of character depth or in terms of political or social commentary.
No, it's a curious beast. Because if you look at Mac Hulk's Pertwee era stories, they feel like they're all written by the same person. And the Faceless Ones, I think, very much does not. So how much of that is just Hulk finding his style and figuring out what he wants to do with Doctor Who? How much of this is to do with the fact that it's co-written with David Ellis, who's a writer whose CV is predominantly episodes of Dixon of Doc Green, and there are certainly elements of the Faceless Ones that read like a kind of more of a police procedural, with staking out the Chameleon Tour's kiosk and waiting until the perps are gone so that you can go and search through their hangar in their office, looking for evidence and things like that. I don't know. It's a shame that we don't know more about David Ellis's other attempts to write for Doctor Who. Right. He had submitted a couple of stories prior to the Faceless Ones, The Clock and The Evil Eye, one of which I think The Evil Eye, all we know is that it was some kind of spy thriller. And there are some James Bondian elements to the Faceless Ones as well, like the contrived laser device that Spencer tries to use ineptly to kill the Doctor and Jamie in one episode, and Samantha Briggs. But I think if we knew more about those two stories, I think we'd have a much better sense of how much of the Faceless Ones is David Ellis versus Malcolm Hulk.
I mean, for me, the obvious allusion is a movie that I grew up with, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. My father was a devotee of the original 1950s version. And that has long legs because I think it was Halloween 3 takes place in the same town as the fictional Southern California town as Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Back when I was an only child and my parents were too cheap to hire babysitters, I would come with them to see movies. So I saw the Donald Sutherland remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers with them in the theater in late 1978. And I still remember screaming in terror when Kevin McCarthy in his cameo was struck by a cab, and the sound that the pods make when they open in the 1978 version lodged in my skull. And when I saw the movie again on TV 30 years later, I had that same childhood freak because I remembered being scared by that noise in the dark in the theater in 1978. But Invasion of the Dinosaurs is a similar story about soulless duplicates taking over your identity. But there, it's a very obvious parallel to fear of communist invasion of America, because a lot of the 1950s black and white sci-fi movies were born out of that same paranoia. Faceless Ones borrows that idea, but it doesn't do anything with it. So for my money, it just kind of falls flat. And the acting performances from Blade and Spencer, the two villains, really don't sell it for me. It does have the sort of Pertwee structure that episodes 5 and 6 take place in outer space, and it removes the original premise of the story. That would be done a lot on the Pertwee years. That's the only really Malcolm Hulkian twist that I can see in the story. And as far as Terrence Dick's novelizations go, I'll cover it after the break in my audio essay. He does some remarkable things with the story, but it's still, for me, a rather dull story to read. And on my top 60 list, Faceless Ones is not on it. I'll ask you, Darren Mooney, the 250 podcast style, does The Faceless Ones belong on a list of the greatest 60 Doctor Who stories of all time?
No, I don't think it does. And I think, unfortunately, I think The Faceless Ones really suffers from its evolution on the way from initial concept to what we wound up with on screen. I know you're not a big fan of the accusation that a story is 2 episodes too long, but in this case, I think it's actually a fair criticism to levy, because The Faceless Ones started life as a 4-part story, as The Big Store, which was set not at an airport, but in a department store. And there it's much more an invasion of the body snatchers kind of thing, because the idea is to replace humanity with this invading chameleon species, as opposed to what we wound up with in the Faceless Ones, where it's this kind of much stranger idea that actually they're kidnapping them to go back to their own planet because their identities have been lost, whatever that really means, which isn't abundantly clear. But if you look at where we are in Doctor Who history at this point, the Faceless Ones aired in April and May 1967. And we've just come off a string going back to the start of 1966 of almost exclusively 4-part stories, beginning with the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, I should say, through the Ark, Celestial Toymaker, Gunfighter Savages, War Machines, Smugglers, 10th Planet. Power of the Daleks is an exception. Then Highlanders, Underwater Menace, Moonbase, Macra Terror. And unfortunately, Innes Lloyd had deemed that for budgetary reasons, this couldn't continue, because the more 4-part stories, the more brand new sets had to be designed, the more cast members had to be found, and that kind of thing. 4-part stories are more expensive. You can't amortize costs the way you do over a 6 or 7-part story.
Right.
So we said, no, this has got to stop. We've got to have more 6 and 7-parters. And so that was part of the motivation then in taking the big store and turning it, the 4-part big store, and turning it into the 6-part, the Faceless Ones. But I don't know that there's actually more incident here. I don't know exactly how the big store played out, but it really feels like the Faceless Ones is probably pretty much that same story transposed onto a different setting, but then just dragged out. And I think that is, unfortunately, that really works against it.
And when Barry Letts takes over in 1969, he will do the same thing. He will commission a season that is essentially full of 7-part serials in order to get around the same amortization problem. At least half of that season, at least 12 of the 25 episodes that air were written by Malcolm Hulke, most of Ambassadors of Death and all of Doctor Who and the Silurians. And then he gets it right, and those 2 stories are incredible, both firmly within my top 60. But yeah, here in 1967, he's not there yet. So I've also been looking at 2 things online. I've been looking at your episode of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is now available for viewing on YouTube. And with your permission, I'll put a link in the show notes. I had totally forgotten that you had a goatee when I met you in 2000, and you don't have one now.
I do not. No, that was I had decided at some point that, you know what, I need to see what I look like with facial hair. So I grew a full beard for about 6 months and decided, no, this didn't work. And then shaved it down to the goatee for about 6 months. And then decided, you know what, clean shaven is what suits me best. So, that was about as experimental as I got in my university days. But it was short-lived.
And the Digby chicken question comes at the 11-minute mark. If you guys want to watch that, I'll put the link in the show notes. But I also have your page open for Faceless Ones. And there's incredible detail in here because you talk about the demise of Shawcraft models. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the transition with Innes Lloyd. They're looking to leave the show. And you talk about the show is trying to get out of Lime Grove D. And when they get renewed for season 5, they're told, nope, you are staying in Lime Grove D. Great detail. I won't give it all away. But we're going to close with a game. And sure. I have in front of me second Doctor Who quiz book, Nigel Robinson. I have been doing quizzes on this on recent episodes of the show. There's only one quiz in this book that I think is suited for you and you alone. So the game that we're going to play is page 65, Behind the Scenes.
All right.
And I'm going to ask you questions 1 through 5, and 3 out of 5 is a winning answer. 5 out of 5 is a perfect score. Nobody has failed this game yet, although stay tuned for an episode that I have already recorded but not yet released for an alternate look at that statement.
Well, that's good. Then the pressure is slightly off.
I'm going to skip question 1, which is a composite. Question 2, which actress who later played the role of one of the Doctor's companions was at first considered for the part of Susan Foreman?
That would have been Jackie Lane, who would later play Dodo. Although, you could argue, because Annika Wills was also seen, was not seen, was on a list of, was on an audition list and didn't show up. So potentially, I don't know who Nigel has in mind there, but potentially you could have two answers there.
The answer is Jackie Lane. And a fascinating fact about Dodo, one of the biggest complaints about Celestial Toymaker is that Dodo is stupid in this story and keeps trying to give the game away to their opponents. What is revealed on the Terry Nation Army video that came out earlier this week is that the reason that Dodo does that in the script is because she was not scripted as Dodo. She was actually scripted as Anne Chaplet, who was from the 16th century and much younger and would have been naive enough to do that sort of thing. And the reason the character is called Dodo is because they needed a 4-letter name to type over the name Anne on the camera scripts and not lose dialogue. And that's why she's called Dodo and not Annabella.
Yes.
So, question
or even Dorothea.
Dorothea. Question 3. Which famous British actor played the part of the Doctor in the 2 Doctor Who and the Daleks films?
Of course, was the immortal Peter Cushing.
Who is sadly not literally immortal.
No.
Question 4. On which 2 Doctor Who stories were the 2 Dalek films based?
Oh, well, the first one was based on the first Dalek story, the Daleks or the Mutants, if you want to be really accurate in terms of what the production team called it. So some would say anal, and if you're listening to this podcast, like myself, that's probably a fair description. And then the second movie was, of course, based on the Dalek invasion of Earth.
Question 5. Which Doctor Who story, scripted by Robert Holmes, was a vicious satire on the income tax system in Britain?
Oh, the Sunmakers.
Speaking of my love for all things archival and historical, I am a Black Archives guy. And the author of the Sunmakers Black Archive, Louis Baston, is a repeat guest on this show. And the Sunmakers, in his view, is not merely a vicious satire, but it's actually a different anti-colonial story altogether. If you have not read any of the Black Archives, and if you're my audience, most of you are probably Black Archives writers. If you're not, go out and read them. Question 6. In which story did William Hartnell as the Doctor turn to the camera and wish all his audience a Merry Christmas?
That was in the Feast of Stephen episode of the Daleks Master Plan.
Well, unlike on the Canadian edition of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, filmed in the West 50s in Manhattan in the summer of 2000, you get a perfect score, although I do not have $1 million to give you. So as our parting prize, here is a Digby chicken.
Well, thank you very much. It looks delicious.
Shannon, this was a bunch of fun. I will try and bring you back towards the end of the show, which I have not booked. This show has probably a little less than a year left, and I'll try to make sure we hear your voice again on a future episode.
I would love to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
And briefly, where can we find you online or on the socials if my audience wants to track down more of your excellent work?
Best place to go is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time Travel, which is at www.shannonsullivan.com/Doctor Who.
All right, Shannon, thanks again. Have a great night.
You too, Jason. Thanks again.
Doctor Who, The Faceless Ones, written by Terrence Dix, broadcast as The Faceless Ones, teleplay by David Ellis and Malcolm Hulke, televised in April and May 1967, paperback release date May 21st, 1987, target book number 116, cover artist Tony Mazzaro. In the summer of 1966, thousands of young people are taking their holidays with chameleon tours, and not one of them is coming back. When the TARDIS lands at Gatwick Airport, the Doctor is drawn into a web of intrigue and deception. To add to his troubles, Polly mysteriously vanishes. Or does she? The girl at the Chameleon Tour's desk looks like Polly, and even sounds like her, but she claims she comes from Zurich. Who is she really? Who is behind these abductions, and for what sinister purpose? Soon the Doctor and Jamie must face a desperate group of faceless aliens. The deadly chameleons. Having the Faceless Ones show up on the bookshelves in 1987 would seem to have been an occasion more for uh-oh rather than yippee. It's a story that takes time out from its plot to have an airport manager harass an underling for making an unauthorized long-distance call to Athens. For those of you born in the 90s, long-distance calls were a thing 57 years ago, very expensive. And while the selling point of the TV serial was the location shooting at Gatwick Airport, and while the back cover blurb mentions it, the actual text doesn't. Anytime Gatwick is said on TV, the novelization, which otherwise faithfully captures the dialogue, omits the reference. But, be that as it may, Terrance Dicks is the author you need, the man you want, to liven up the Faceless Ones. Terrance was in the late 70s the novelization's principal author, so we talked a lot about him in the early days of this podcast, the first 18 months or so. But with audience growth and contraction and listener turnover, there are probably many of you who didn't hear all the various ways I praised Terrance over the first 60 or 70 books of the Target line, and here we are at book number 116. So for chapter 1 of the novelizations, let us revisit an impromptu top 10 list, David Letterman style, from the home office in Syosset, New York. Number 10. All landings are tricky until you're actually on the ground. Terrance randomly occupies the POV of a jet pilot for a single sentence. Number 9. Inevitably, being the doctor, he had landed them in the midst of danger. In fact, although they didn't realize it, the danger was far greater than their present unfortunate position in the middle of a busy airport runway. Terrance foreshadowing to make you keep turning the pages. Number 8. His nickname amongst his subordinates was the Commandant, and if some of them believed he would have been better suited to a career in the Gestapo, they were careful not to suggest it within his hearing. Perhaps Gestapo is too strong a comparison for such a bland character, but World War II was a major influence on those who created 1960s Doctor Who. Number 7. Although he didn't realize it, Terrance says this all the time, more foreshadowing. Number 6. Charles Gordon was about to encounter the most subversive and anarchic figure of his entire career in the shape of a shabbily dressed little man known as the Doctor. And that's the entirety of Doctor Who distilled into a single sentence. Number 5. The Commandant hated emergencies. Another POV shift. Terrance tells us that the officious airport controller hates emergencies, and you better believe the rest of the book is going to be one emergency after another. And this guy is going to play the hapless straight man to the second Doctor's unique and destructive problem-solving methods. Terrance Dicks joined the show during the Troughton era and writes him better than any other author. Only Jerry Davis really comes close. Number 4. One of the monitor screens came to life, showing a head and shoulders view of a fair-haired man with a broad, somehow cat-like face and hooded eyes. Tertiary characters in Terrance books get exactly one sentence to describe them, but Terrance always makes those sentences quotable. Number 3. For once, the Commandant was dealing with a personality as forceful as his own. Terrance uses that line a lot, too, usually, but not in this particular case, referring to the Doctor. Number 2. This particular crime wasn't really his business, of course, but then, neither were most of the problems he got himself mixed up in. Terrance lightly lampoons the Doctor's penchant for getting into trouble. And number 1. Chapter 1 last sentence. They hurried after the Doctor, though had Polly but known, she had good reason to be afraid. Another Terrance specialty is inventing a moment not on TV, or expanding on a reaction shot, to create a chapter cliffhanger that makes you want to keep reading. And that's just all in the first 10 pages of a slim 134-page book. Many people over the years have said that Terrance writes pale, script-to-page transcriptions of the TV without adding detail. This is the most incorrect opinion ever held. In peacetime, Terrance adds value to everything with his constant asides and observations and jabs. To be fair, this book is not Terrance's most inspired work. While the value is in the humor and tension and interstitials, this story is far from my favorite Troughton. So, let's visit some high points. Terrance mocks Jenkins, the passport control officer, played by our good friend Commander Andred. Of Jenkins's overlong inspection of some random woman's passport, Terrance writes, page 23, deciding that the plump, middle-aged lady in front of him wasn't the head of the KGB in disguise. By the time he got around to writing Endgame, Terrence's Cold War spy thriller during the Eighth Doctor adventures trapped on Earth cycle, he'd probably have dropped in a reference to Beria or some other period-appropriate figure, but Terrence's KGB joke here still works. Chapter 3 features the first of many battles of wills between the Doctor and the Commandant, the officious and hidebound Commandant, the kind of foil that the Troughton Doctor excelled against, and Terrence leans into this by showing us what each man privately thinks of the other. The Doctor is fascinated by banal clues, such as an unused Spanish postage stamp, or burnt fibers on the floor of a hangar building, while the Commandant gets more and more annoyed. This is the sort of comedy of manners that Terrence writes in his own stories, most notably Horror of Fang Rock and State of Decay, or the Second Doctor scene with Colonel Crichton in The Five Doctors. It occurs to me that the Chameleons were foolish to name their fake air charter company after their evil plans. The Doctor wouldn't have unraveled their entire scheme in Chapter 4 if they had just picked a random and banal travel name like, I don't know, Magical Mystery Tours or Abduction Air. I also have a dim memory of American fandom in the late 80s, running into the early 90s, believing that Polly's last name was Lopez, an error probably derived from Annika Wills playing a character named Michelle Lupi in Episode 2, Annika's final in-studio work as Polly, her next and final scene being her Episode 6 departure, which had already been filmed on location earlier. Chapter 5. Samantha Collins' Liverpool accent is described as a faint, nasal twang. Now I asked Jim Sangster about this. He says that is not what a Scouse accent sounds like. Inspector Crossland loses his Scottish accent, which was a clue to things that happen later in the serial. See page 75, for example. Crossland's Episode 3 TV line, a wee bit unorthodox, in the book is reduced to certainly more than a little unorthodox, and I'm sorry, lass, is missing in the corresponding scene on page 81. Jim says Terrence probably worked from the script rather than the surviving video, so might not have known that Crossland was Scottish. The Doctor pretends to be a terrorist with a grenade in the airport, which, yeah, you could never do that as a gag on Doctor Who in a million billion years again. But Terrence salvages all this with his running commentary on the tightly wound Commandant, page 52. Quote, the Commandant, back at his desk, was rapidly working his way through a pile of paperwork. Order was being restored. They were back on schedule, or schedule, if you will. Planes were landing and taking off with a beautiful, mathematically precise regularity that delighted the Commandant's orderly soul. If only nothing else went wrong, he might actually win his daily battle against the forces of chaos. On page 57, chapter 6, the Doctor uses his sonic screwdriver to break into the Chameleon Tour's ticket office. This didn't happen on TV, not least because it's only season 4, and the sonic screwdriver is a year away from being invented. Either Terrence didn't know the screwdriver's exact origin moment and unintentionally created a continuity error, or he just felt like sneaking it in anyway, even knowing it didn't strictly belong. Similarly, chapter 7, page 64, quote, the Doctor, despite his appearance, was no more human than Spencer himself. Spoilers! We're 2 years away from War Games on TV. Page 68, quote, Jamie wasn't really used to bossy females, and he wasn't equipped to handle them. Now, the one constant in all of Terrence's books is that no male ever knows how to handle a bossy female. Terrence ends chapter 7 with another cliffhanger. Most of the book's dialogue is almost word for word from the TV. There are some changes, with Samantha Briggs translating some German words on TV in episode 3, which she doesn't in the book. But chapter 7 ends with Samantha speculating that not just her brother has been kidnapped, but, quote, hundreds, maybe thousands of others as well. She doesn't say that on TV. It's a tension line that in the book forces you to not stop reading for the night at chapter 7 and just plow ahead. On TV, though, it's all one long scene without any logical stopping point. We've talked a bit during all the Patrick Troughton episodes of this show just how many good humanoid villains the Second Doctor faced off against. Tobias Vaughn, the Warlord. Sorry, I'll say that the way James Bree said it. The War Lord. Well, that doesn't sound like Jamesbury at all, but that's the best that I can do. Salamander. Don't forget Salamander. As if I could. But the Troughton era also has some dreadfully dull human villains too. Solicitor Trask in the Highlanders, Cavan, the space pirate, though that book's quite a long ways off in the life of this podcast. And in this book, Captain Blade and Spencer of Chameleon Tours, banal serial killers who've A, got no personality, and B, are terrible, or I suppose much of my audience would say rubbish, at their jobs. Chapter 9 covers the Goldfinger-esque attempt to kill the Dr. Jamie and Samantha with a slow-moving laser beam. Terrence at least has fun with the instantly dated technology. Page 86, quote, "It looked like some incredible ancient camera, but was in fact an advanced automatic light cannon." Episodes 1 through 3 take up 78 pages. Episodes 4 through 6 take up just 56. Well, not exactly 78 pages. The last page of the Episode 3 material takes up a single sentence on page 84, but this means that Terrence has to start trimming dialogue to make the last 3 episodes fit into the book. Chapter 10 removes a lot of texture from the Commandant, including his continued disbelief of the Doctor's outer space theory, and his harassing Benedict Cumberbatch's mom about those long-distance phone calls to Athens. Chapter 11 actually adds text. Captain Blade disciplines a flight attendant, played by Mrs. Peter Purvis, for missing the fact that Jamie's snuck on board without a passport. On TV, he merely points out the discrepancy, but in the book he says, quote, "Such carelessness is inexcusable. You will be punished." Page 103. This is not a Terrence quote, but the episode 4 cliffhanger closes chapter 11 as the Chameleon Tours airline becomes a spaceship and rendezvous with a space station. Flight 419 had arrived, says Terrence, page 104. Chrissy's online transcripts page, however, is much funnier. Quote, "Flight 419 is now a rocket which has left Earth's atmosphere and entered the blackness of space to rendezvous with a huge conical satellite in geostationary orbit, which no one, including NASA, Jodrell Bank, and NORAD, has noticed up there." The book changes things up with Nurse Pinto a little. In the book, the Doctor finds the original nurse's body in the medical center in the Episode 4 material and helps the authorities find it in Episode 5. She's described as senior and very cunning. On TV, the Doctor doesn't notice Pinto in Episode 4 and needs to be shown where she is in Episode 5. The word senior is no longer used to describe her role. This makes the book version of the Doctor slightly more sinister, knowing all along where the original Nurse Pinto was, but leaving her on ice, so to speak, until he has more of an upper hand against the chameleons. The truncated page count for the back half of the story becomes really evident in Chapter 13. Terrence does not include the TV bit, where the Doctor can't understand Samantha's Liverpudlian expressions.
Doctor, what's happened to Jamie?
What on earth are these doing here?
Dr. Jamie wasn't anywhere near the kiosk last time. Look, you're not listening. I think they've got Jamie.
Jamie, where?
Well, you should know. You got him to pinch me ticket.
Pinch a ticket?
To stop me from going to Rome.
Oh, you mean Jamie has...
Has gone in my place.
First Polly, then Ben, now Jamie. We've no time to lose.
A tense sequence on TV, where the Commandant is ordering the arrest of all the chameleons disguised as key airport personnel, intercut with the Doctor realizing this is the one thing they must not do. It's condensed to 2 or 3 lines in the book with no intercutting. Terrence the Shade Thrower returns on page 128, doing what he does so well, laughing out loud at plot holes or contrivances. Quote, "In the airport's huge crowded car park, Samantha and Jean Rock were checking car numbers one by one. Perhaps foolishly, they had decided to test their theory alone, rather than ask for help." Terrence ends the book with a narrative trick he has not done since the Unearthly Child novelization back in 1981. On page 140, as the Doctor and Jamie, now sadly without Ben and Polly, look for the just stolen TARDIS, Terrence writes, quote, "The Doctor and Jamie walked away towards what was to be one of their greatest adventures." But not Doctor Who in the Space Museum, the next Target novelization. Terrence refers, of course, to the next televised story, The Evil of the Daleks, which at the time was considered one of the greatest. Whether it is or not, we'll explore on Doctor Who literature, but not next week, because that novelization is 6 or 7 years away in calendar time, and nearly a year away in the life of this podcast. So next time, on Doctor Who literature, it is not Evil of the Daleks. It is, in fact, the Space Museum. Joining me next week is the executive producer of Doctor Who literature, David Barsky, all the way from Southern California, and we're going to have some fun. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who literature. The executive producer, like the man said, is David Barsky. This podcast is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Shannon Sullivan. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.